Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Strategies for Setting High-Quality Academic Individualized Education Program Goals. We'd like to thank you for joining us today. My name is Tessie Bailey, and I will be the moderator for today. Before we begin, I want to orient you to a few logistical details about this webinar on the next slide. For technical issues, a webinar team member will try to assist you as soon as possible. To contact, you'll see a box on the right-hand side where you can submit questions or comments at any time. For content questions, please feel free to submit your questions at any time as well. We will either respond to the question in the chat box to you individually or as a group, or we'll share them with the presenters during the Q&A at the end of this presentation. Throughout the webinar, we will be sharing links to resources discussed by today's presenters in the chat box. So right now, if you look in the chat box, you can see the link to our handouts, including today's PowerPoint presentation. We'd like to start today's webinar with a brief poll about your familiarity with available goal-setting resources. Please take a moment to answer the following question on your screen. Which National Center on Intensive Intervention goal-setting resources have you used? And feel free to check all that apply. The guide, the strategies for setting high-quality academic IEP goals, the NCII Academic Progress Monitoring Tools Chart, our training module, our Student Progress Monitoring Tool for data collection and graphing, or maybe you've not heard of any of these, then just select the last box, which says none. I just learned about them. We've got great participation in our survey. Okay, so we'll close up our survey. We've got about 75% of folks who participated. And I want to share that most of you, 51%, indicated that you had never heard of these resources, which is great, which is the purpose of today's webinar. Most of our focus will actually be on the first one, the strategies for setting high-quality academic IEP goals. So you've come to the right place today. A lot of you have heard of our tools charts, about 33%, and 33% of you have accessed some of our training modules around how to set goals. One of the resources that was new to folks is our Student Progress Monitoring Tool for data collection and graphing. We recommend checking that out. You can include up to 8 students in the Excel resource, set your baseline and set goals, as well as input progress monitoring data and print graphs for free. So thanks for participating in our first webinar. And so I do want to just let folks know that today's webinar is sponsored by the National Center on Intensive Intervention and the Office of Education Programs' newly funded Progress Center. The Progress Center, which stands for Promoting Rigorous Outcomes and Growth by Redesigning Educational Services for Students with Disabilities, provides information, resources, tools, and technical assistance services to support local educators in developing and implementing high-quality educational programs that enable children with disabilities to make progress and meet challenging goals. The center's full website, promotingprogress.org, will launch in early May, so we'll keep you posted. Today's webinar is the first of a 2-part goal-setting webinar series sponsored by NCII and the Progress Center. Today's webinar focuses on setting academic IEP goals and will demonstrate how educators can use the first resource that was on that list, Strategies for Setting High-Quality Academic IEP Goals, as well as other related NCII resources to improve your goal development. You can access a copy of the guide on the NCII website or check out the handout section of today's webinar. We will also model 3 academic goal-setting strategies and share local and state application of goal-setting resources and lessons learned in using those resources. The second webinar in this series, which is actually scheduled for March 13th, will focus on setting behavior IEP goals. And I'll share more about that webinar towards the end of the session. Again, my name is Tessie Rose Bailey, and I am the director of the Progress Center, and I serve as a principal consultant for the National Center on Intensive Intervention at the American Institutes for Research. As today's moderator, I'm pleased to introduce the other speakers for today. Weingarten is a researcher for the National Center on Intensive Intervention, as well as the Progress Center. He supports evaluation activities and product development for both centers. Thom Jones is the Wyoming State Professional Personnel Development Grant Director and the State Systemic Improvement Plan, or SSIP, Coordinator at the Wyoming Department of Education. In his role, Thom also provides direct coaching and support for IEP and intervention goal setting for target districts. And Justine is an amazing special education teacher at Freedom Elementary School in Cheyenne, Wyoming. She not only has experience in developing high-quality academic IEP goals, she coaches and supports teachers in her district in writing realistic yet ambitious goals using the resources that will be shared today. Before we begin, I would like to provide some context for today's content. On March 22, 2017, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a unanimous opinion in Endrew F versus Douglas County School District. In that case, the court interpreted the scope of free appropriate public education, or FAPE, requirements in the IDEA. The court overturned the 10th Circuit's decision that Endrew, a child with autism, was only entitled to an educational program that was calculated to provide merely more than de minimis educational benefit. In rejecting the 10th Circuit's reasoning, the Supreme Court determined that to meet its substantive obligations under IDEA, a school must offer an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. The court additionally emphasized that the requirement is that every child should have the chance to meet challenging objectives. Now, we get a lot of questions through our centers about how this looks in practice. And what we know is that ensuring students with disabilities have an opportunity to make progress towards challenging objectives requires setting realistic and ambitious annual IEP goals. Now, the IEP is a valuable tool for educators. It's not just an annual requirement. It outlines the goals for what students need to know or be able to do, and it clarifies how progress towards those goals will be measured. These goals, which are driven by a statement of present levels of academic and functional performance, or PLAS, help teams design and implement high-quality educational programs that enable children with disabilities to make progress towards and meet challenging goals. Despite the power of IEP goals, we continue to see common pitfalls, such as lack of alignment with class or goals that focus too narrowly on specific skills. In addition, IEP goals continue to be measured by observational trials or anecdotal notes and data, which are not easily interpreted for responsiveness. To support educators in preventing some of these pitfalls, NCII created the guide for setting high-quality academic IEP goals. My colleague, Zach, is going to walk you through this useful resource, and he'll model 3 validated goal-setting strategies presented in the guide. Zach?
Great, thank you, Tessie. So I'm going to discuss some strategies for setting high-quality academic IEP goals. As Tessie mentioned, these are the strategies that we share in the guide. So I'm going to summarize the guide, essentially, and if you want more in-depth information, I really encourage you to check out the guide. The resource is available on the NCII website at incentiveIntervention.org, and the link is also in the chat box. I just wanted to say also that while the strategies that are described in the guide are geared towards setting an IEP goal, they're also applicable to setting intervention goals for students receiving Tier 2 or Tier 3 interventions who don't have an IEP. So in the guide, we present these 4 steps for setting an IEP goal that you see up here on the screen. The first one is selecting a target and a measure. Second one is establishing baseline performance. Third is choosing a strategy for setting the goal, and then finally writing a measurable goal. So in the guide, we explain how educators can use these steps to set goals that are measurable, ambitious, and appropriate for the student. And while this guide is geared towards educators, it's important to remember that all members of the IEP team, including families, should be involved in discussions about setting the goal. So the first step that we present in the guide is to select the target and the measure. So when we're talking about determining the target behavior in academics, we're often talking about target behaviors such as math computation or passage reading fluency, or it could be math concepts and applications. Those are some examples of target behaviors that we might want to measure. Once we've identified that target behavior based on the student's individual needs, we want to identify a measure to assess the student's progress. And so in the guide, we present these two broad categories of measures. The first one would be a single skill measure, which is also known as a mastery measure. You see that on the left side of the screen. And this would be used to assess a student's mastery of a discrete skill. So in the example here, we see that the educator wanted to assess the student's mastery of the short vowel A for a few weeks, and then assess the student's mastery of the short vowel I. These are useful for measuring progress on short-term instructional objectives, but they're less useful for monitoring students' maintenance of skills over time or progress towards progress on a broad set of skills. In addition, these mastery measures have some limitations related to their psychometric properties and their capacity to model student growth. So on the right side of the screen, we see a general outcome measure. And general outcome measures are indicators of general skill success that reflect overall competence on an outcome. So these might include all skills that will be taught in the annual grade level curriculum, or they focus on a skill that reflects overall competence in a domain, such as reading connected text. So these are what are more commonly recommended for setting annual IEP goals. They're useful for describing students' growth and development over time, and for providing information on students' current performance and their rate of development. Another benefit of general outcome measures are that they're frequently simple and efficient to use and sensitive to students' improvements. In addition, publishers of these assessments typically provide information about national norms that allow students' performance to be compared with peers. So whichever type of measure you choose, it's important that these key characteristics are considered. So we want to make sure that we're choosing a valid and reliable tool, most importantly. And the Academic Progress Monitoring Tools chart on the NCII website will help you determine whether the tool that you have selected meets some of these criteria. So the second step that we discuss in the guide is to establish the student's baseline. So it's important that the student's baseline be set using the same tool that will be used for progress monitoring. And there are three approaches that we present in the guide. The first one is to use the student score from universal screening. For this to be a valid baseline, you want to make sure that progress monitoring begins within 2 weeks of when this data point was collected. The second option would be to administer 3 progress monitoring probes in one testing session and to select the median score. So in this example here, you can see that the educator gave these 3 reading passage probes to the students in one session and then selected the median words read correctly and the median number of errors to establish the student's baseline. The third option would be to calculate the average of 3 consecutive progress monitoring scores collected during separate testing sessions. So in this example, they took the first 3 data points from progress monitoring, found the mean of those, and used that as the student's baseline. So it's important that we use this baseline information when writing the PLAF statement. So the student's baseline score should be included in the PLAF. So for example, you may write a statement such as, when given a standardized passage at the 2nd grade level, Chris currently reads 55 words correct per minute with 93% accuracy. So while that information should be included, it's important to recognize that that would not be a complete PLAF statement. in and of itself. It's also important to include additional information in the class, but we do certainly want to include that baseline score. So the third step that we lay out in the guide is to choose a strategy for setting the goal. And this is where we present the bulk of the content in the guide. And we review these 3 strategies. And so on the right side of the screen, you can see that there is a 1-page handout which provides an overview of each of these goal-setting strategies. So that's in the back of the guide and is a useful reference. And so there are 3 validated approaches to setting goals that we cover. The first one is using benchmarks. Second one would be using national norms for weekly rate of improvement. And the third one is using an intra-individual framework. So for option number 1, this is using benchmarks for middle or end of year performance. This is a really straightforward approach, which makes it a great choice for setting goals. It can be especially useful for students who are performing at or close to grade level. So to use this approach, the educator would simply locate the benchmark. These are often included in progress monitoring data systems, published tools. They'll include the middle or end of year benchmark, and you would just take that and use that as the student's goal, which would then be plotted on their progress monitoring graph. Again, some advantages of this are that it's easy to use when the progress monitoring tool provides benchmarks. It tracks progress towards grade level expectations, which is where we want our students to be, and it's efficient for setting goals for a large number of students. However, this may not be an appropriate approach for students who are significantly below benchmark. So in the guide, we recommend that to determine whether this is an appropriate approach, you could calculate the weekly growth rate required to meet the goal and compare it to the typical rate of improvement from national norms. So if the student is going to be expected to make more progress per week than a typical student is making, then you may not want to use this as an approach. So in terms of where to find these benchmarks, many of the published progress monitoring tools include middle and end of year benchmarks. You can use the NCII academic progress monitoring tools chart to find out whether many tools have these benchmarks available. For measures that don't have these published benchmarks, you can look elsewhere. We also include on the NCII website some compiled oral reading fluency norms that you could consult, or you could find other published research that includes national norms for benchmarks. So the second option that we present is to use national norms for rate of improvement. And this is an approach that uses a standard formula for calculating the goal using the rate of improvement. So national norms for rate of improvement are based on the typical growth of students from a national sample. So many progress monitoring tools provide these national norms for each grade level, and they oftentimes help educators calculate goals based on this information. So this type of goal setting is used when the benchmark is unrealistic during the intervention time frame, but the student is still expected to make growth comparable to peers. So to use this approach, you would find the rate of improvement based on what the information the tool provides, multiply it by the number of weeks left in the intervention, then add the student's baseline score to get your goal. So this is an approach that includes this is an somewhat individualized approach because you're incorporating the student's baseline score when you're setting the goal. So you're taking into account where the student is starting. So it provides a mechanism for writing an ambitious but realistic goal based on the student's initial performance. This is useful when the benchmark is unrealistic, as I mentioned, but the student is still expected to make growth comparable to peers. one consideration to keep in mind is that if a student is performing below grade level peers, matching the normative rate of improvement could maintain an achievement gap in some cases. It's also worth noting that some progress monitoring tools provide recommendations for ambitious or typical rates of improvement. So here's an example of how you can set a goal using this approach. So in this example, the rate of improvement was 1 5/10. So the educator would find that information and then multiply it by the number of weeks left in the instructional period, which in this case is 10. Add the student's baseline score, which in this case is 52, to arrive at the goal of 67. So that would be an example of how to use rates of improvement for setting a goal. In the guide, we provide a practice opportunity. So Appendix A is an opportunity for you to practice setting a goal using the benchmark and norms for rate of improvement methods. So I encourage you to check that out in the guide as well. Answers are found in the back of the resource. So the third option would be to use an intra-individual framework. This is often used for students who are performing far below grade level or with very low skills where typical growth rates are not appropriate. So to use this method, you're going to take the 3 most recent data points to calculate the student's baseline score. And one important distinction with this method is that rather than basing the growth rate on national norms, we're calculating the student's individual growth rate based on their previous performance. So that would be what SROI stands for, student's rate of improvement. So you're going to base that rate of improvement on at least 8 data points. So to use this option, we take the student's rate of improvement in the intervention so far, and we can calculate that a variety of ways. In the guide, we provide more details on how to calculate their rate of improvement. It's also called slope. And we're going to multiply that by 1.5 or 1 5/10. The reason we're going to multiply it by 1.5 is because we want to make sure we're increasing their rate of performance. So we want to generally increase we want to make sure we're holding them to high expectations, and we're holding ourselves to high expectations. So we want to improve their growth rate by about 50%. So we're going to multiply their previous growth rate by 1.5, and then multiply it by the number of weeks left in the intervention, and then add the student's baseline score to arrive at the goal. So again, this is useful for when students are performing far below grade level and standard growth rates are not appropriate. Some considerations here are that this option is the most complicated in terms of calculation. So it could be difficult to understand and calculate, and therefore may require more training and support. It also requires the collection of at least 8 data points before setting the goal. So that requires a little bit more time. And it's important to remember that this is likely not necessary for students performing at or near grade level. On this slide, we see an example of setting a goal using this intra-individual framework. So first, the student's rate of improvement, SROI, is calculated. In this case, it's 1 word read correctly. And so in the first 8 weeks of the intervention, that was the rate of improvement that they were making per week. We would then take that slope and multiply it by 1.5 because we want to boost their rate of growth by about 50%. We're going to then multiply it by the number of weeks left in the intervention, which in this case is 10 weeks. So we have 1.5 times 10, and then we're going to add the student's baseline score, which is 19, to arrive at their goal of 34 words read correctly. It's important to mention for all of these strategies, once you arrive at the goal, you want to add that to the progress monitoring chart along with the student's baseline. And you really need the goal line, which connects the baseline to the goal in order to see if the student is on track. So in the guide, there are a couple other practice opportunities. So Appendix B is a practice activity for setting a goal using the intra-individual framework. And then Appendix C is an activity where you get to practice all three types of goal setting. And again, the answers are included in the back of the resource. The last step that we present in the guide is writing a measurable goal. And so we want to make sure that the goal that we write includes or addresses the condition or context in which the skill will be performed, the target behavior, as well as the level of proficiency and time frame that would be needed. So, for example, we also include this sample IEP template structure. So you could write a goal such as, when given a standardized third grade level reading probe, Michael will read 99 words correctly in 1 minute with 95% accuracy by spring benchmarking. On the next slide, you can see that we provide a table with some examples of statements that fit each of these components. So in terms of the first component, which is condition, here we may be talking about things like the material or tool used, the grade level, the setting or the timing involved. And so it could be statements like, when given 30 first grade sight words, or when given a third grade reading passage. The next component would be the target behavior. So here we have the observable behavior or the target goal. So this could be a statement like, the student will read 30 of 30 sight words, or the student will read 60 words correctly. And then finally, we have the level of proficiency / timeline. And here we have things like the accuracy, the timeline, or the number of trials. So it could include information like 95% accuracy, or 3 consecutive probes, or by spring benchmarking. It's also, before I turn it back over, I just wanted to mention that in the guide we have this sort of checklist that we include. You just want to make sure that your goal is measurable. So some of the items on the checklist include, is the goal quantifiable? Can it be observed? Can data be collected systematically? And can the data be graphed? So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tessie, who will move things on to the panel.
Great. So before we move to the panel, I do have 2 questions that I want to share before we move forward. Zach, can you briefly just share the pros and cons of each method in terms of closing the gap with their same grade peers?
So I would say, in terms of closing the gap with the same grade peers, I think that, I know that using benchmarks, of course, would be probably is the one that comes to mind for me first, because that essentially is exactly what that would do. If the student could reach that benchmark, that would mean that you would have closed the gap with same grade peers. Of course, it's really up to the IEP team to decide whether that's an appropriate strategy, because, as I mentioned, hitting that benchmark in some cases requires a rate of growth that may just not be realistic. So it's really, I think, important to consider, as I mentioned, what the typical growth rate might be and how the student, whether the student would be able to match that or exceed that growth rate.
Right. And I think something to recognize is the rate of improvement is often used, as Zach mentioned, when the student is unable to reach the benchmark during that same year. But it is feasible that the student may close the gap over a multi-year period of time when we're using ambitious growth rates. I think the biggest concern that we have with these strategies is with the intra-individual is that you are setting an expectation that's based on individual previous growth, and it's not likely to help the student close the gap because it's based on a growth rate that is not typical. It's not like typically developing grade level peers. So hopefully that helps. There was another question I just want to reference. You talked about the progress monitoring tools chart, and we received a question around all of the available progress monitoring and universal screening tools available on the tools chart? And the answer is no. Right now, the tools chart includes tools that have been submitted for review by publishers. So if you do not see your tool on the tools chart, we highly recommend that you contact your publisher and ask them to submit for review so that they can make it on the tools chart. All right, well, thank you, Zach. And at this time, I'm pleased to introduce my colleagues Thom Jones and Justine Essex from Wyoming, and they're going to share the reflections on IEP goal setting in action. Our panelists will be responding to several questions that were submitted prior to the webinar. If you do have additional questions, please submit them in the questions box at any time, and there's some time after they're done addressing these questions that I will present those. I'm going to pass this over to Thom Jones first.
Hi, thank you very much, Tessie, and I appreciate the opportunity to kind of share our experiences and lessons learned with this process. Before I begin addressing the questions that you see on your screen, we had received two other questions kind of beforehand that I think we need to address. The first question deals with how do teachers manage progress monitoring so many goals? And they're talking about when you have fairly large caseloads, 20+ students each, with numerous IEP goals. And one of the processes that we work with our teachers is that we're really focused on those students who have the most intensive learning needs. So we ask the teachers that we coach to really focus on very select goals and the data collection approaches that are brief but very reliable. And what we see is those students that we're progress monitoring weekly, that it's a very small number. The larger portion of their caseload, as long as they're making progress toward their IEP goals, may be monitored a lot less frequently. I'll get it out in a minute, whether that be monthly or even bi-weekly. The other question that we received too is when not using a norm-based measurement tool, how do we set appropriately ambitious goals? So this is something that we've dealt with in some of the schools that we coach teachers with before they got really progress monitoring tools that they used, or we've also done it with our early childhood child development centers, so preschools, as part of our state improvement project. At any rate, what we do in those cases is we establish a baseline through very similar method as the Intra-Individual framework, and then utilizing that baseline and continue to track student progress, we then utilize the student rate of improvement to calculate the goal. At this point, there's a little bit of flexibility because once we have an established goal, we usually will come in and tweak it, really depending on kind of the teacher's experience, their familiarity with maybe adapting interventions to make them more challenging for the students, and where we may kind of consider that rate of improvement that we could kind of push the student a little bit harder to make it a little bit more ambitious. And in some cases, we'll increase that number. And I hope I'm sitting here just double checking to make sure that I answered all of those questions. Oh, and then one other thing too, without Val, I did want to add this to this last question, is that there is a progress monitoring tools, and I know a lot of the tools that are available out there have a graphing function in it, but a lot of the teachers we work with prior to getting those tools with graphing functions, we utilize the progress monitoring tool, the Excel sheet offered by NCII, in order to track and monitor the progress of the students in our project. So on to the panel questions that you see on your screen. Our context that prompted the use of this and related resources. So with the state of Wyoming, we're involved with what is known as data-based individualization. And this is really looking at students, focusing on these student subset skill deficiencies, and developing or intensifying an existing intervention to move that student along, to really kind of assist them in their progress. I'm sitting here double checking my notes real quick. So we drove this as part of our state improvement plan, And once we began working with teachers in the implementation of data-based individualization, we realized two things. One is a number of the teachers that we're working with actually needed this skill of setting goals, and those that didn't were explicitly asking for that set skill. So bringing this in really became a natural extension of the work that we've been doing within the state, both under the SIP, and has become an integral part in the coaching process that we utilize with the teachers in our project. And I think as far as that question is concerned, Justine may actually have additional information that she would like to include if possible.
Sure, thanks, Thom. As far as the context that prompted us to use this and the related resources that we're using now, the resource teachers within my district were just really frustrated with the lack of tools and resources to use with our students. We really wanted more professional development opportunities in the area of goal setting and interventions and progress monitoring. And collectively, we kind of voiced our concerns to one of our special services consultants from our district. And so with the wave of her little magic wand, she brought in Thom and Tessie to help us with that development, using the tools that NCII has developed. That's kind of how we got started in all of this. The next question is, how are you using this and other goal setting resources? Right now, I'm just tailoring it to my students and their individual needs. Obviously, our students are not cookie cutter kids. We have to do what we need to do to meet their individual needs. So I'm using it to guide the focus for my instruction. Those goals that I've created within their IEPs are really driving the instruction that I'm doing daily in my classroom with my students. And really, truly, my students and the parents and our IEP team is a part of that goal setting process too. Thom, did you have anything to add on to that question?
No, ma'am. I believe that pretty much covered the same thing. I mean, as far as us using those resources, I talked about it a little bit on the last question, and that it is just a natural extension of the project database individualization that we're doing here in the state. Exactly.
So the next question is, what impact has this had on your work and student performance? For me, really, truly, not only goal setting, but just DBI in general has changed my teaching world in such a positive way. My students are motivated to want to do better than the week before. We love having celebrations and sharing the data with anyone throughout our school, whether it be their classroom teachers or our principal or our secretaries. Everybody loves being involved in those celebrations when the students are meeting their goals, and they're just so excited to share in their progress. Overall, though, the goals are specific and attainable, and I feel really confident, attending IEP meetings and leading those IEP meetings and saying, here's the data that your child has from this past year, and look at their growth, and look at goals being met. And that's the biggest thing for me. It's just a big celebration in our kids and their abilities, whatever those may be. So that's the biggest impact that DBI and goal setting has had on me.
And Justine, can I just interject? And then I know that you actually had some students who exited out of special education, and I think that was based on setting grade level benchmarks that students were, once they were able to meet the benchmarks, it was easier to have the conversation about moving a student to a less intensive level of support, where some kids were in resource or now in more inclusive supports. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, Tessie, you're spot on. I did use those for those students that eventually were exited from special education. I used those benchmark norms in creating those goals. And so once those students were, close to meeting those goals, I'm not only talking to their classroom teachers and talking to their parents, but I'm also using the the tools that Gen Ed is using to make sure that my data that I'm gathering is correlating well with what's going on in Tier 1, so those Tier 1 screeners. So yeah, I'm not having to guess whether a student is making progress or not. I know where they are and I know where they need to be, and like I said, I'm using a whole bunch of different tools and, you know, communicating with parents and teachers to be able to make those data-informed decisions.
Thanks.
All right. The next question was, what are your future plans related to goal setting? Obviously, creating more goals. As resource teachers, we're continually creating new IEP goals, and I'm no different. So just making sure that I'm setting those attainable but ambitious goals is super important for each of my individual students. Right now, I'm currently a DBI coach in the district that I'm working in. So I'm helping other resource teachers in making appropriate goals for their students, and also finding intervention and tools to meet the needs of their students as well, and progress monitoring their process, just basically coaching them along that whole DBI process. I'm hoping soon that I can be a part of the conversation at the building level when putting students through our building intervention team. I know Zach had mentioned earlier that this doesn't necessarily have to be utilized within that Tier 3 special ed instruction. It could also be really beneficial when setting goals for our students who are in Tier 2 interventions. So I'm really excited about the future and the work, you know, at my building and at my district, or yeah, in our district too. Thom, did you have anything with that?
No, the only thing I would add is that as far as future plans related to that is, again, we continue to get requests from districts and teachers throughout the state for specifically that resource. And so we're incorporating that into our yearly educational conference that we have here in the state, as well as other trainings that we roll out for professional development.
All right, and the last question is, what are lessons learned from improving the quality of goal setting practices? For me, I would say you really don't have to guess. There are PDFs, webinars such as this, and videos that NCII has supplied on their website to assist you in your goal setting practices. Really, truly, there's so much out there that they've created for us that it's so helpful, and just being able to utilize those resources and read those resources and implement them within your classroom. That's my biggest lesson learned. They've done a lot of the grunt work for us.
And I would add, from my perspective, as far as lessons learned on that is how far you really can push students when you have an accurate, attainable goal that you're really focused on, that intentionality of driving instruction toward that goal. It's amazing. I've seen a lot of teachers that we've worked with where they're working with students. They're like, you know, I don't know, we're going to see a whole lot. We hadn't seen a whole lot in the previous year. And we sat down and we really looked at creating a solid goal and then a plan on how to reach that goal. And in probably 9 times out of 10, we've pushed those students not just to the goal, but beyond it. And so having that clear vision is just been so huge for the buy-in for our project, and including my own buy-in to the work that we do.
All right, I think on the next. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I just want to interrupt for a sec. We did get an audience question that seems really timely based on your lessons learned. And the question is around this collaboration between general education and special education. And they indicate it sounds like in order to have that, you really have to have strong collaboration between the two. Was that culture already in existence in your site? And if not, how did you, or how are you getting there?
Yeah, so that was already kind of established at my building. All of the teachers that I work with, I'm very blessed. We communicate often, if not daily, on some of our kids' progress, and they're a part of, like I said, obviously the IEP team, but I'm constantly sharing the data that I have collected through my tools with them, and like I said, including the parents in that as well. But just letting classroom teachers know that they might not be on grade level necessarily, but they're growing in their own right. They're making progress as it relates to them and the skills that they have. It's just it's exciting for all involved, and most of the time, if not all the time, the teachers want to be a part of that. So I don't know if I answered the question very well, but yeah.
No, I think that's great.
Tessie, I was going to add too, and we have such an amazing group of educators in this state, and I've been privileged to work with so many of them. But you don't always see kind of, that type of collaborative work taking place. And one of the interesting things that we have found, and I guess this would be added to a lesson learned, is that in some cases where we don't have that harmonious, intermixing of gen ed and sped, that a lot of this work in goal setting and progress monitoring, tracking really has empowered a lot of our special education teachers to kind of open the doors of that conversation. And I think that when you have that type of data, it becomes very powerful. And through that, you can gain a lot of the buy-in from your general education folks as well. So even where it wasn't pre-existing, it exists now because of this process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to piggyback off that too. I bring the data, I bring the graphs to the IEP meetings. And so the gen ed teachers are seeing that and they're like, how do I get my hands on this? They want it too, which is, like I said, why I'm excited to be a part of those goal setting practices on a building level at tier 2. So
let's see your data.
Yeah, go ahead. All right, this is a student of mine that came in. Really, his baseline was, we didn't know any letter names at the beginning of the year. This is a first grader. So I screened him. Like I said, no letter names at the beginning of the year. And sorry, this chart's really fuzzy, but we got up to, I think, 42 on our last progress monitor. So making great goals, or making great gains, excuse me. And again, it's a part of that celebration for this particular student. He loves just being pumped up by the people around him and being so excited for him. So we're right on track to, meeting those goals in this area. So like I said, this was the letter names. I think on the next slide is the same student with letter sounds. So still trying to work up there to our goal line, but still a great trend line for our little guy. I think it says on that last one was 25 letter sounds within 1 minute. So he's shooting up there, which is great to see. On that last graph that I have is just a regular fluency, oral reading fluency progress monitoring report. For this particular student, he is close to being back on grade level. So I have selected a benchmark goal for this student, but again, making pretty good gains, somewhat inconsistent, but overall that trend line is moving in a positive direction. So these are the things, these graphs that I have here are the things that I'm sharing with everyone. I'm sharing with parents. We're having those intentional conversations with the students. When we're first progress monitoring, like, where do you want to be by the end of the year? What do you think is a good goal? And again, sharing this data too with the gen ed teachers is super important to see that, the students are making gains.
Great. So I do have a question about your first slide, and maybe you can just talk about briefly which tool you're using and how you determined what was the benchmark that you might use for the student.
Yeah.
Was it embedded in the tool, or yeah?
Yeah. Okay. So on this first slide, the tool that I use is FastBridge. Many teachers choose different tools for what they want to use, but like I said, I've chosen FastBridge. Within that tool, they give like a given ROI for that individual student. So for this particular student, I've used an ROI based on like their baseline. But like I said, for that third slide for the fluency passage, I used the benchmark norm.
Great. And another question we received is around a student who is both being monitored on letter names and letter sounds. And the question is, do you write your goals with more than one measure? And I'll take the first stab at that from a recommendation standpoint, is that we often recommend writing your IEP goal at the highest level. What is the most general outcome measure that's appropriate for that grade level, as Zach had mentioned in his section? In some cases, you may be monitoring on both of those because you're trying to provide or to gather more information about how the student is responding. They might be responding to one area of reading but not another. But for an IEP goal, we often recommend at the broadest indicator of proficiency that you expect. And we do have a question, one more question, and I just want to put it out there, and it's related to attendance. And I can't remember if it was at your school or another, but you did have some students who struggled to attend the intervention or weren't attending school. And how has that impacted perhaps any of your IEP goal writing?
Tessie, I haven't had any kiddos like that necessarily, but obviously that plays an impact on fidelity with intervention and consistency. So I'm not sure how to answer that question because I don't know. I haven't been in that situation, so sorry.
Okay. And well, and I did respond, and I think one of the things, as we talk about in some of the DBI training, is the intervention or the specially designed program is one piece of what we do, but it's also around the fidelity of implementation and exposure to the intervention, whether it's attendance, you know, are they actually in the instruction that you're providing is critical. And so if attendance is interfering with the student's ability to access the curriculum or the specially designed instruction, then what we need to be looking at is designing interventions that are focused on increasing the student's attendance. And that may be requiring, you know, wraparound services or partnering with the parents or other community service providers, depending on the student's reason that they're not attending. There are some great resources on the NCII website to consider around intensification strategy checklist and some problem-solving teaming resources that might help a team problem solve around how do you address persistent attendance issues, whether for an individual or a group of students. All right. Well, I would like to thank our presenters today for sharing goal-setting resources, their strategies, and their stories. As with most webinars, you probably have lots of questions, and we've only had time for just a couple of those. For those we don't get to today, we will be posting a follow-up resources and responses as needed. I think we've addressed most of them, but I will. We did have one that I want to pose. But you will be able to find all of these responses where you'll find the recorded webinar from today, as well as the PowerPoint presentation. We did receive a question around why don't we include the baseline in the goal statement template that we present in the guide. And that's because that is included in our PLAFs. Some states do ask that practitioners include that in their goal statements, but IDEA is currently, when they think about that baseline data, it often occurs within the PLAF statement, depending on how your IEP is structured. Okay. Well, our time has come to an end, and I'd like to reflect on what we heard today and share several other resources to help you on your journey to set appropriately challenging goals for students with disabilities. It's important to remember that IEP goals, and we'll go to the next slide, focus on student behavior and not education or educator behavior. We want to make sure that they are monitored with enough frequency to determine progress and make timely instructional interventions. I mean, some kids might need to be monitored twice a week, where others might be okay being monitored every other week, or in some cases even monthly. We want to make sure the goals are measured using objective, valid, reliable measures rather than more subjective measures. And most importantly, I think, is ensuring that the goals are realistic yet ambitious. We know that while there are some similarities in academics and behavioral goal setting, there are many differences, and that many of the strategies shared today do not apply. As a result, we have also developed a guide for strategies to setting data-driven behavior IEP goals. And we do have an upcoming resource that's coming out, as well as the resource is out. You can find the link in the chat box. But we have a webinar that's coming up that will share strategies for setting behavioral IEP goals. It's scheduled for March 13th, 2020, from 12 to 1 Eastern Standard Time. And during that webinar, Terry Marks from the National Center on Intensive Intervention and the Progress Center, as well as Dr. Faith Miller from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, will model how to set ambitious behavioral goals for students using valid, reliable progress monitoring measures, and then we'll share how to write measurable and realistic goals focused on the replacement behavior. In addition to the guide that was shared today, there are additional resources available to support you in monitoring annual IEP goals and setting those goals in the Endrew era. Consider checking out our previous webinar, Recommendations and Resources for Preparing Educators in the Endrew Era. And there you can learn a little bit more about Endrew, as well as its impact on students with disabilities. You can also check out the National Center on Intensive Intervention Progress Monitoring Tools chart, and there you'll find tools, as Zach mentioned, to support goal setting using both single skill as well as general outcome measures. You might also appreciate the 2 informative IRIS modules that are available. They are featuring 2 of our Progress Center senior advisors, Mitch Yell and David Bateman. And finally, to stay up to date, we recommend that you sign up for our quarterly newsletter. We have one for NCII and the Progress Center, and you can access the sign up on our website. NCII is continually adding new resources to support educators in designing and implementing intensive intervention. And the Progress Center, just based on its name, will be providing resources to support you in ensuring ambitious growth for students with disabilities. Our website is expected to go live early May, and so sign up so you don't miss it. And finally, I'd like to thank you for joining us today to learn more about setting high-quality academic IEP goals. If you would like to stay connected, please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And please have a wonderful day. Thanks.